Archon mode represents the future of the real-time strategy genre and seems perhaps to be the strongest case for the real-time strategy genre engaging and picking back up all the steam that it had in the early 90s and 2000s and becoming one of the primary games by transforming a 1v1 e-sport 1v1 game type into a multiplayer game type without abstractly cutting away the portions of 1v1 that make real-time strategy games so very compelling. So the mode is called Archon mode, but if you're not familiar with the concept, the word Archon in this case comes from StarCraft 1 and 2, where two units, the High Templar, would have had the ability for the Protoss faction, the Protoss race, to fuse together and they would create an Archon that was mightier than either one of them individually, this very powerful AoE short-range blast unit. The idea simply was as follows. We're going to put two people on a team, and they're going to control one player's set of actions. This used to be called micro-macro back in the days of mods before it was made official as Archon mode in StarCraft II Legacy of the Void. The idea simply being, look, maybe you're new to the game. I'll handle the macro aspect because macro is very taxing mechanically and doesn't seem very fun. And my economy will grow if I macro and I focus on all these workers. And maybe all of my buildings will be built up appropriately, and that's wonderful. But it's not really the fun aspect of the game. The fun aspects of the game seems to be, why don't I just take units and fight them? And so a macro mode was a way where you could get a less experienced player who perhaps enjoyed wanted to practice their unit control, give them control of the units, specifically the army units, let them go and have a field day with that, while typically the more mechanically sound or more resilient player, the person who just wanted to focus on unit production, stayed at home, looked at the bases, and made sure that units were constantly producing. This is a way that you could go ahead and team up against someone who is more experienced, a third player that's more experienced than either you or your teammate, and have a decent chance of having a good game against them. Alternatively, you could do it as a 2v2, my partner and I versus you and them, and you would get a game that would actually resemble 1v1 StarCraft Brute War, StarCraft 2 play without actually being a 1v1 game. You would elevate the skills in theory between the two of you, and it would be this team component that would make more than the sum of its parts. This isn't a new idea inside of real-time strategy games, although most people know of it as Archon mode, courtesy of the influence of StarCraft 2 and the giant community push that was put towards Archon mode in that game, and that came out, Legacy of the Void, I want to say. Well, the Wings of Liberty was 2010, so from 2010 onwards, that's where the real-time strategy genre influence has really been for this mode. But Command & Conquer also has through Red Alert 3, the modding community there has created their own version of Archon mode. It goes without saying that Age of Empires also has an equivalent of Archon mode where you can control the allied units that are allied to your team, so you set yourself equal to the team of the other player, and then you can control their units or buildings and vice versa. And that's kind of unofficial. You have to work it out between the players to make sure that that's what's going on. But it could be done. And here's the excellent thing about Archon mode, is that it does two things. It fixes two problems that most people have with real-time strategy games. One, real-time strategy games are extremely difficult, and two, they want to play the real-time strategy game without feeling like they are a burden. So, here's how this fixes both of those issues. Real-time strategy games are very hard. One of the posts that was made, and I made this in the Reimagining RTS Tutorials video, but it nevertheless stands, and I don't think enough people heard it. Real-time strategy games are really a menagerie of different sub-games and entire genres in and of themselves, slapdashed together inside of a single giant genre that asks way too much of the player and asks them to do way too many things way too quickly, and they can always have room for improvement, and that is crushing to some people. It's particularly crushing to people who are not lifestyle gamers. If you're not willing to devote yourself to the craft of improvement, so typically the feeling in the RTS community goes, then either become that person or get out. This is not the game type for you. Now that's excellent in terms of maintaining the competitive spirit and the integrity, and also there is something to behold about how a single person can improve in all these various areas. And you look and you see a person who's playing at 200, 300, 400 actions a minute, you just think, oh my god, how can anyone possibly do that? They're controlling everything, and they seem to have like eyes in the back of their hands, much less hands in the back of their eyeballs. They can see everything, and they're so cognizant, like the mini-map and the movements of the units, all the focus in the micro, but also the macro in the background is excellent. And the thing is, that is impressive, and it's beautiful, and it's amazing to watch, but a lot of people don't ever reach that pinnacle. A lot of people don't even get to the point where they can observe that pinnacle. A lot of people don't even get to the opportunity where they can find out what they would like about real-time strategy games because they're too stuck in some of the subgenre areas. They're stuck on the unit production. That's very difficult mechanically to get used to. They're stuck on the peculiarities of unit control. Well, I'm not used to controlling this many units. Maybe I'm used to controlling one from MOBAs, or maybe I'm used to controlling a handful from something like a tower defense, but not really in the same way. And now all of a sudden I've got dozens upon dozens of units, and I have this whole map that I have to explore and interact with my opponent. And additionally, how do I understand what I'm aiming for, what I'm doing? It's a 1v1 strategy game. But there isn't something like chess where it's capture the king or kill that castle. It's more like, I've got to beat you, but it's really open-ended as to how I beat you. And that's intimidating for a lot of people, especially since real-time strategy games as a genre don't exactly have the hundreds of years of experience behind them that games like chess and Go do. Although, funnily enough, new players in those games also, as soon as they're just barely, once they're past the point of knowing what all of the pieces do and have some very, very general concepts as to how things work, capturing and the object of the game, they immediately are hit by the same kind of analysis paralysis. The difference is that in those, we have games that are, in these cases, hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and so there is a wide community of people that can reach out to and ask for, and even these days during the COVID-19 novel coronavirus, COVID-19 panic or pandemic, however you want to say it, there are plenty of people that you can reach out to for chess clubs and Go clubs and learn how to play all of these other kind of strategy games in a way that real-time strategy games simply don't have the access to. So this Archon mode fixes the fact that real-time strategy games are hard because it identifies exactly the point of complexity for the real-time strategy game, which is it is all of these different subgenres. So if we break up the genres into separate locations for each person, then there we go. You now have access to this and that and that. So you're in charge of macro in terms of making units, and you're in charge of workers, and you're in charge of army units, and that's the way that you can split it up. But here's the other aspect that this addresses, is that when you play most recent iterations on real-time strategy games, or ways that people try to reinvent the genre, they always go to this team game aspect. And I wonder why you're doing that, because it seems like a natural fit. After all, that's something that the MOBA market is doing. We're going to take arena games as they used to exist, and we're going to set them inside an arena where you only control one unit, and to compensate for the fact that you only have one unit, then you're going to have teammates who also only have one unit, and so coordination between them is very important, and you get to put maximum micro and maximum focus on this one unit that you do in fact control. The problem with that for real-time strategy games is that you can make armies, if you have superior macro, that are just bigger than your opponents. And so if you're a really, really good player, let's say if you're a 6 of 7 player, and you have 2 1 of 7 allies, and you're up against 3 2 of 7 opponents, you might just make an army that's so big that you just push them over, and all of the extra teammates that are at a slightly higher skill level didn't really help the other team. It doesn't work for skill disparity in quite the same way. And so here's the thing about that, is that splitting up actually doesn't seem to be the solution. Giving more teammates to people doesn't seem to be the solution. It might work for cooperative because the opponent is an AI, but as soon as the opponent is a human being and they have their own tricks and traps and tendencies and proclivities and tactics and things that they enjoy doing, and the way that they enjoy manifesting their skill in the game, be it by small unit micro, be it by dropper eyes, be it by making a ton of units and just bowling you over, be it by taking over the map with a lot of bases. However they want to do that, it introduces complexity that more people don't necessarily solve the equation for. In fact, it has been my experience that when you play those large 3v3 games, sometimes one of your allies, who's supposed to be helping you, is sitting over on a gold mine or a base that you would really rather have yourself because you are the more powerful player. Or they have units that are supposed to aid your army, but you can't force them to come and help you, and so you just think, wow, I'm really doing this by myself, and then you have to spend time typing and talk to your opponent, or you're on voice chat and you're communicating with them. And the problem is, all of these things are things that happen inside of MOBAs as well. The difference is, with MOBAs, you don't ever get the sense that in a MOBA, no matter how skilled you are, that you could do better for the team if you controlled their champion and yours at the same time, because the points of the map that you're looking at are so different, and the distances on the screen are such that it's probably not viable for you to do that unless you are drastically outscaling them to a preposterously ludicrous degree, because the opponents, even if they are of very low skill level, are looking at a MOBA at one particular champion that they are controlling, whereas if you just had the production structures that you could add, and you could add your allies' production structures to your own, and you're good at macro in a real-time strategy game, it doesn't really change much if you go from, in a little wargame context, from having 4 barracks that you have to macro to 7 barracks that you have to macro, and you're just making their units out of their barracks as well. And so that's the frustration that you feel in a real-time strategy game that you don't necessarily feel in MOBAs or these other team games. Let's get into this aspect too. when you spread out all of those bases like that for all of your teammates, in a MOBA, it's brilliant. Because yes, each player represents a point of strength and a point of weakness, but there are towers that are meant to help defend in the inner areas, and there are also minions that help, and there is flexibility given around to moving around the map. If you have a weaker ally, in a MOBA, there are devices increasingly being restrained and restricted, but you can carry your way out of that position. The way that you normally carry out of that position in a real-time strategy game is by making more. The problem is that if you make more, or if you have sufficient, excellent unit micro, there does become a point at which the opponents have so much stuff that your advanced skill doesn't actually matter. Your ability to make more doesn't actually happen. If you have never experienced this before, go into a little war game, play a game of 2v2 Symmetry, and load up someone who is a friend of yours or someone that you generally tolerate and enjoy and consider to be on friendly terms with, so you don't rage out at them, but someone who may be brand new or very, very new to the experience of real-time strategy games. And let's say that you are a 6 of 7 player and you load up with them and they're a 1 of 7 player, and again, you play against 2 4 of 7 players. You're better than either of the other players individually, but the fact that eventually they get to a point where they can just have enough units that it is actually physically impossible for you to match the number of units that they have, and your ally is not helping sufficiently to help bridge the gap. Even though 6 of 7 and let's say 2 of 7 for your ally is a total of 8 of 14 skill, if you're up against 2 4 of 7 opponents, they will bowl you over, provided they don't die immediately, for much the same reason. So, the solution doesn't seem to be diversify in a real-time strategy game, add more allies that have their own bases. Because if a player is new, let's look at how that feeds back into the first point. Besides, if a person is new at real-time strategy games, giving you allies that are also new and are barely producing extra units or barely making productive actions is not going to help you unless you can take control of them, in which case, why are they playing, is the way that they normally feel. This is where Archon mode enters, and it's excellent, because Archon mode flips the script. Rather than say, we're going to give you a teammate. Sound. I love team games. Team games seem to be the things that are most popular these days, aside from single-player RPGs or things of that nature, that have big AAA like press releases and things going on. A lot of people like things like Valheim that they can go play with other people and enjoy together. They like things like League of Legends or Dota 2, where they can group up with some friends, sit in voice chat, and they can play without feeling like they would just be better off, in terms of gameplay, of just controlling their unit and the opponent, like their allies' champion as well, because they don't think that they can do that. But that is the thought that you can have in a real-time strategy game. So Archon mode fixes this by saying, what if instead you are one player and all of you are one player? Okay, sound. We've reached that higher skill point that I was talking about previously, but why do I think that people don't use this enough? Because let's think about this. The way that Archon mode is normally structured is macro-micro, and that is, you're the person that creates the stuff, or you're the person that individually selects and uses the things. The problem with most macro-micro mods, and the way that they're implemented inside of real-time strategy games is, one, we're just going to just put this right out there to begin with. The first problem that they have is that they're not exclusively micro-macro mods, and we'll get to that in a second. The second thing is, they don't actually tend to be, they just don't tend to really work on the Archon aspect as well. So let's get to the micro-macro aspect, and the way that these are like mods that are just kind of generally imported in. Let's say it's a micro-macro mod, and you're with someone who's a 7 of 7 skill level, and you're a 1 of 7 skill level. The way that it would work in theory is that they pick a role, and you pick a role, and never shall the twain meet. For instance, even no matter how frustrated the more experienced player gets, they can't, if they're the person who's making units, decide, I'm going to be the person who's controlling units. They're not allowed to do that. But that's not how it typically works. How it typically works is that if there is a great enough skill disparity between the players, especially if there are new players inside of the real-time strategy game genre, what tends to happen is as follows. The more experienced player gives, the newer player, perhaps their friend, perhaps someone that they're interested in teaching or coaching or just having a good time with, or maybe it's a random pickup game, and they let them micro, and as soon as they realize, wait a second, I'm doing all of this macro, I can do their thing better too, then the players start fighting each other. Then the player that is the micro, or let's in this example, the person who's the 1 of 7 skill level, thinks, why am I even in this game if every time I make a move, you countermand it with 3 more of your own, and also you're so fast, why am I even here? I'm clearly not helping you. I'm of no benefit to you. I'm not changing the structure of the game at all for you. There's nothing that I'm doing that's being helpful. So what's the point of that? And so that's the first fault of most Archon modes, is that, in fact, you know what I mean? They don't actually make it so that it's possible for both players to feel like they don't solve the initial problem. You don't solve the problem of the new player feeling like they have a role that they can do that is subdivided and sectioned off for them that only they can do. Because at any time they can be overruled and countermanded by the boss or by the person who thinks that they can do better on their own team of two, which is the way macro normally works. Then why are they there in the first place? So the first thing that has to be done for such mods is split them off entirely. The second thing is, why are they in groups of 2? Make them in groups of 3. Now think about this. Why groups of 3? Because most team games are 5v5 or 3v3. Think of Rocket League, 3v3. Think of basketball, 5v5. Think of, that's not a video game, but here is one. League of Legends, Dota 2, 5v5. I believe it was called Drop Zone, which was like a MOBA with some RTS elements and like a Heroes of the Storm-like feel to it. 3v3 game. You look at most squad-based games. In fact, in the FPS genre, they are dealing not with squads of 1. They're dealing with individuals, squad of 1. Or if they have a team component, they're squads of 3. They don't tend to be squads of 5. That tends to be too large. There tends to be too much going on. Now, those are different genres, but the wisdom seems to be that having a team of 3 or 5 is good, and given the number of units that are going to be made, a team of 3 makes sense, whereas subdividing everything into a team of 5 in an RTS might actually be too many players for the amount of tasks that one player's worth of resources has to accomplish. And so I would change the rules for Archon mode to be as follows. This is why it's called tripling down instead of doubling down on Archon mode. One player controls the workers. One player controls the unit micro of army units, and another player controls the macro, as in they make stuff out of the buildings. So the person who controls workers controls what buildings get built. The person who makes macro can only produce out of those buildings, but to include the starting structure in Little Wargamer's castle, or the whether you call it the castle or the keep or the fort or the market, whatever your game's starting location is. The macro player controls anything that produces a unit. In addition, they control the upgrade facilities and things of that nature. The buildings are their domain. Then the third player will be in charge of the army micro. This tends to be, something that's fun and enjoyable and a lot of people want to do. But if you explicitly separate all of those roles and you make them in sets of 3 instead of sets of 2, we can see how there's less overlap. In normal micro-macro, unless it's explicitly separated from the get-go, who's in charge of what a worker does for defense? What about a worker building a structure? Is the person who makes units out of the structure in charge of the worker? Or is the person who's in charge of the units in charge of the worker? The worker is in fact a unit, but the thing that it primarily does is construct buildings, so that's the domain of who really does it, and it gets even worse in the case that these things aren't deliberately separated out. So just make the person who uses workers their own third person. Additionally, teams of 3 are excellent if you've ever experienced them in communicative senses for video games. Like, look at games like Company of Heroes 2 have excellent 3v3 conversations and communications. Some closed betas and technical pre-alphas that I've been involved in were 3v3 games. Excellent communication. If you haven't experienced it, just go ahead and I'm not going to say take my word for it, but try Rocket League or something like that. You'll see a team of 2 and a team of 3 have vastly different dynamics. And I could get into a whole video on that, but we're not going to get into that. Let's get into the other aspect that makes that Archon mode currently fails at. So we've talked about how the first thing is they don't tend to explicitly separate the micro-macro component. 2, they have 2 rules, micro-macro, as opposed to the 3 rules I believe that they should have. Third thing is their mods. What are you doing? Excuse me? Hello? Real-time strategy genre. This is like me, a guy, speaking out to you, people who are listening. Why do you insist on not implementing Archon mode as a primary core feature of your game? Here's what I mean by that. Notice that throughout real-time strategy games, I mentioned Age of Empires, I mentioned Command & Conquer, I mentioned literally 2 decades worth of StarCraft. People deliberately, as soon as they have an editor and someone comes across the idea, thinks up the idea of micro-macro or of Archon mode. They think it up and they institute it. No matter how much difficulty they have in doing it, no matter how well or poorly suited the editor is to managing that task, no matter what external resources they have to make to generate to make it happen, they do it on their own, of their own time, free, out of the passion, the desire to have it. That says they want it in the game, and that actually suggests that you could make a game that is Archon mode at its base. And what I mean is, don't make a normal 1v1 RTS. There is something truly wonderful about seeing players that play 1v1 games in the sense that they are the person who's controlling everything. That's excellent, that's wonderful, but that's not popular because isolated events that focus on the improvement of the individual are almost never popular. Having a person take on the responsibility of being the seeker, of being the person who's going to go and travel and traverse the things that are in their domain and exceeding their domain and then bringing back competency onto themselves for which they are the only ones responsible for failure and also the only ones responsible for success is not something that people tend to do. It's not something that are aligned to do, and a very small subset of gamers actually have that inside of them, let alone people in the world at large. And so why are you asking people to go outside of the game's development to go and try and find external developers to make mods to do this? Just put it in the game directly. And in fact, don't just put it in the game. Make it a primary tenet of the game. You can put imagine if I had sold you this. We're gonna call it. Let's see. I got a drink right here. We're gonna call. I got a drink and a purple bag with dice in it. We're just gonna see what dice I pull out. It's gonna be a D6 and a D20 and a D8. Okay, so we're just gonna call it we're just gonna call it eraser can. Hopefully that doesn't mean anything. Eraser clipper. There we go. Or erase clipper. Sure. We can call it anything you want. Here's the idea. I'll call it Suba, actually, because that's what I'm looking at right now. Ladies and gentlemen, this summer 2021, enter a real-time strategy game, the likes of which you've never seen before. Be part of a team of 3, merged into the consciousness of 1. Play as id, ego, or super ego, as the 3 of you fight and build an army to overcome your enemy commander. And while you 3 work as 1, know too that your opponent's team is 1 working themselves as 3. Will you engage with the small micro of the army, battling and fighting across the front lines, generating the skirmishes that will win the war? Are you the supply effort in the back, spawning out the forces, responsible for all of the tech tree decisions, and using your masterminded strategic ability to institute dominance over the invisible hand of the game? Or are you the subtle economical individual? Are you the worker who makes sure that through the revolution of your hard hand, sweat, and brow, that everything that need be built is built according to the perfection of a man laced with architectural guidance in his veins? That's right. Pick between the 3. Will you, how would you say this? Will you build the future? Will you control the future? Or will you save the future? Which way you command is under your control. This summer, Suba. Imagine that, right? Imagine if someone told you, all right, here's a 3v3 team game, but here's the catch. All 3 players are actually controlling 1 team individual. Well, that's just like any team game. No. You misunderstand. They're going to play a traditional real-time. They're going to play a real-time strategy game, except we're going to separate all of their roles so the 3 people are merging their consciousness into 1 commander play. What an amazing idea! First off, here's the thing that you're getting out of that: you're dramatically improving the quality of the game, because if you make them separate so that one cannot control the roles or the functions of the other, then you may get people who are RTS players who feel like, well, I can play a whole RTS, so of course I can play insert this sub-faction of the RTS. Of course, that's what they're going to choose to do. Maybe you're a MOBA player who enjoys the unit micro that's involved. Okay, you're going to go ahead and do that. Oh, but now we're going to attract the grand strategy people who actually really understand the impact of decision making and what builds are going to do and how ordering is super important. Or maybe you're one of these people who's newer to the game and you're like, well, I don't want to deal with actually knowing the economical side of the game or just making stuff, but I would like to see units explode and fight each other. You can get the new person on that. All they have to know is unit control. If you want to get a person who's like, I don't know, man, I don't want the pressure of that high speed micro. I'm more of a methodical person. They can be the person who's the builder who's working on the economical side. You can be the person who's like, I am the Shadow Master who will make sure that everything goes on as planned, absolutely, and I will guide our tech to the revolution. Then yeah, you can be the macro player behind behind that, instituting your vision. It was crafted for you, but you're the one who's executing it at a baseline level. And the thing is, there's enough going on in real-time strategy games that all of these people would have something to do. And here's the thing, too. Most team games, there is a role that, whether it's explicitly defined in the game, as in the case of MOBAs, or it is suggested in the game in the event of things like Halo team duels, there is a role that tends to be supportive, that tends to be less mechanically required, less mechanically taxing. Those people, you're now working in teams of 3, so they can have a shot calling element. Who's going to be watching over the minute? I think you think I've covered everything. I haven't covered everything at all. Who's going to understand what the impact of scouting is? Who's going to look at the mini-map constantly? Who's going to be the person who's like, oh, wait a second, I gotta tell the worker person that we're about to get supply blocked in case they missed that. Oh, but this is what we're interacting with. Who's going to be the person who makes the shot calling and the game plans and the decisions moving forward? Sure, the person who is in charge of unit micro might control the army, but they might not necessarily know where to go, but they might be amazing in a fight. These are all things that you see in other games that there is a team component into, and especially in things like MOBAs, where one player can show that off because that is what the role of the champion typically, or of their lane, shows, suggests, and can be made manifest. But when you have a team component, you now have increased level of skill. You're introducing a whole generation of people to real-time strategy games in a way that is natural to the way that they have been experiencing games. They've been experiencing them as team games, and they are finding out what they like about the game. And additionally, because they have teammates, no one wants to talk about this, but this is reality. It's a team game. It's not 1v1. So if they lose, it wasn't really my fault, was it? It was this other guy, or this thing happened over here, or that thing happened over there. So they don't have to, if they don't want to. Now here's the thing. It kind of impugns the excellence and the wonder of watching these players play 1v1. But you know what it doesn't impugn is the likelihood that more people are going to play real-time strategy games if they feel that there's someone that they can blame, discuss, argue with. If they could just bring friends into the game, it doesn't all have to be negative. Having teammates gets a bad rap for all of those reasons. But what if you have a player who is new to the game, or a family member, or a sibling, or a friend, or a relationship, something like that, and you want them to play the game that you're very invested in? You can give them the role that is less mechanically challenging. There's a reason that we find so many people, I will just say, of certain genders, let's say, that suggest themselves in certain roles for certain MOBAs, and that's all I'll say of that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually good that that is what happens, because it means more people are playing the game, more people are finding out what they like about the game, and I love real-time strategy games. So I think that what we have to do is no longer double down into Archon mode by making it something that's officially supported or integrating into games. Well, I think that RTS games should triple down on Archon mode and make it the way that you play the game. Make it a 3v3 inside of the guise of a 1v1, and then let's see where real-time strategy games go from there. If you enjoy the content that I make on this channel, or for the Little Wargame RTS channel on Twitch, or throughout any other space that involves Little Wargame, please consider subscribing to the Patreon link in the description box below.